All right. So is the kind of most secure way to transact CBDC, or what could potentially become CBDC, also the most optimal for interoperability, right? And we can also get into two-factor authentication and how this could be applied to like cross-border payments or other digital systems, whatever the case may be. And basically where we're going is having multiple signature transactions, right? To where there are multiple private keys used for one transaction, right? And so again, basically these private keys could be held by separate actors, right? So it could be the person who's paying, the recipient, maybe an intermediary, government entity, whatever the case may be, right? And so that is some of the questions, or that raises some questions about how this design choice would be used, right? So like, who holds the other keys? Would it be an intermediary, like I said, a custodian, the recipient, whatever? And does this change based off of tiering? So like with access tiering, depending on the characteristics of the transaction, how much you're sending, when, how often, who's the counterparty. To give examples, does the amount of private keys change, or does the amount of, say, or not the amount, but does who has to give private keys change? Like with certain transactions, maybe it's just only you have to do it below a certain amount or whatever. Or maybe you and the recipient if you're sending it to them, or maybe adding an intermediary or custodian in there as well. Again, just giving examples, right? And a lot of this information is coming from a recent paper published by the Office of Science and Technology, and I will put a link to that PDF in the description below so you guys can read it yourselves and so on, and discuss it, right, if you wish. So that being said, so again, a recipient, or I guess one reason why a recipient may want to hold such a private key is basically in order to verify correct receipt of funds. So maybe, that's kind of like a designated private key for someone. And that's the one they use for whenever they're receiving, and they have to use this one to verify they received the correct amount of funds or whatever the other characteristics, correct time that you got it. Maybe it's rent or something, and maybe they have another one specifically for when they were sending it, right? And that could be one example of having multiple private keys or multiple signature transactions, right? And so this could also be applied for a CBDC system that's interoperable, maybe with other digital asset systems, maybe with stable coins, whatever, just giving examples. Other fiat systems. So like maybe like our domestic commercial banking system, if you want to convert CBDC into commercial bank deposits or whatever the case is, for cross-border payments could also be another example. If you're trying to send them internationally, maybe for remittances or whatever the case is, like maybe if you move to one country to work and then want to send money home, that's a popular example for it. Things like that, right? That could be another example for having multiple keys, to where maybe there's some kind of international entity or embassy or whatever that deals with that, right, to transact the CBDC across borders, right, to other jurisdictions that may or may not have different standards, rules, so on, right, just to muddy it up even more. But regardless, another thing to keep in mind is having the multiple signatures and kind of looking at it more in the terms of two-factor authentication. So like if you have two keys for you sending CBDC. So like maybe you have separate devices where one's on your phone and one's on like a specific CBDC device or whatever it happens to be, right? Just to give an example, or at least what's coming to mind right now. If I could speak English today. But anyways, by having this sort of kind of two-factor authentication, you could think of it as it could help prevent like phishing and like kind of other scams that you see online, that sort of thing. Maybe you get kind of, we'll say, unsolicited funds, right? And basically, if you interact with it, it's kind of a way of that whatever malignant party, will say, who sent you those unsolicited funds, is trying to like wean information off of you or whatever the case is, depending on, like when you do transact with someone, what data is saved for that transaction, right? Maybe they're trying to get more than just your public address or whatever, right? So again, looking at kind of the pros and cons of this, of having multiple signature transactions, right? So it's likely more secure, like we talked about with the two-factor authentication. That's an idea with it, right? You could also have another key held by a trusted third party, we'll say. Whether or not you trust them, separate topic, at least for now. This one's kind of just looking at the pros and cons of this, and we can get into that more later if you guys are interested. But basically, this trusted third party could be used if a key is compromised, and you could either generate a new one. Since it's a central bank digital currency, it'd probably be different than you would typically have for like your typical digital wallet. In terms of generating private keys, it could be different, at least. Not really sure. I haven't seen anything specifically about private key generation in the terms of a central bank digital currency, or at least how it would be applied in, say, the United States, or could be applied. I haven't seen anything talked about in that, and with respect to that, in terms of the literature that I've found thus far, we'll say, right? And again, I kind of already talked about cross-border payments and how that would go into it. You could also look into intermediary, or how the intermediary holds funds. So maybe they could use their private key to hold funds in escrow until certain transfer conditions are met, much like a real estate transaction or whatever the case is. Just anything that you would have to have a significant amount of conditions met before the transaction would go through, or those funds actually transfer, right? That could be an example of one. Could be helpful to have multiple signatures, just so it's just, I don't know. It would be easier to facilitate those types of transactions with multiple keys, it seems, right? Now, kind of looking at more of the negative side effects, or kind of consequences in a way, of having multiple signature transactions, it is probably less functional and less efficient, just because there's multiple of them. It can really muddy things up, especially when you apply kind of access tiering to that. At least that's what it seems to me. Harder to use for people who are, we'll say, non-tech savvy. Talked about this a little bit before. Some people just don't kind of want to learn, or they just don't get technology. That's still a thing. It's not very frequent, I've noticed, at least from my personal experience. I know that's more anecdotal, but still. So there's that. Some people just don't want to learn how to use it. That's one thing, and I don't blame them, especially when you're talking about CBDCs, but regardless. So also, if multiple keys are needed for even low value transactions, safety features may not be worth it, right, for that poor customer experience, right? And this is where kind of having certain transactions below a certain threshold might not need even a single key to go through, right? Or for you to be able to transact, because that ease of use and the whole safety that comes along with that, we'll say, or security of having the multiple keys might not be worth it for certain people. And so that would be kind of a disincentive to use it for certain things, right? So it might not gain widespread use for lower transactions, especially if they're using it more for the financial inclusion route, to where they're kind of looking at, the types of people, maybe using it for like UBI or something like that, to where, or like food stamps, if they're still called that. EBT, oh my God. I can't talk this morning. Anyways, you know what I'm saying. But like food stamps and that sort of thing, it might be harder to use it for those types of transactions, and those people might not want to use it because it's such a pain to use it for those types of things. Maybe it's even more so than the system we have now, right? Just to give examples, how would this, if you look at it from the perspective of the two-factor authentication, to give another example, would you have to do this at every point of sale device, right? Every time you do any transaction, period, how much of a pain is that going to be, right? Just another consequence of this, right? And that kind of goes into the whole harder to implement. Just having multiple of them, it can really muddy things up quickly. And also, and one thing I haven't talked about in a bit, did a lot in the first few videos in the playlist talking about design choices for this, but offline capability, right? Basically being able to do this offline to where you don't have to be connected to internet. Maybe even you could do peer-to-peer, that sort of thing. That's something that was talked about a little bit in the paper, not really extensively. Not surprising, it's a CBDC, so what can you expect? But anyways, by having multiple signature transactions, that kind of goes out the window, at least to a seemingly significant degree. It seems, especially if you have to get clearing or whatever from an intermediary or like a cross-border payment, because if you have to have like an embassy or whatever use their private key for that cross-border transaction to actually go through quickly, we'll say, then you can't really do that offline, because that embassy, unless they just happen to be there or it's just some person that's kind of that, they're the designated CBDC guy or whatever you want to talk about, unless they just happen to be there, then it's kind of like you have to be online for that. So that's where I'm kind of going with, to give an example of having of the offline capability kind of going out the window, right? But anyways, with that being said, I also did 2 videos on the pros and cons for having no digital signatures, meaning private keys, and then also one for only having one, right? So we're basically just the payer uses their private key, right? And I'll put those as 2 end cards in the right hand side of the screen. So with that being said, hope to see you guys on one of those.